Alright, so it's time to revisit this whole model of the client and the server, if only briefly. I had originally planned on doing some sort of fancy graphics to tell you this, but I think I can just tell it to you face to screen or whatever this is. Originally we talked about this idea of the server, I think, as a barista. You walk in, you ask for something, the server goes and grabs it, hands it to you. That's the basic static model. So we've been creating files and putting them on the server, and what happens is we take an HTML file, we put it on the server, someone calls that up from the outside, from the web, types in a URL, that request goes to our server, the server goes to the file that's specified in the URL, opens it up, and spits all that stuff down the wire to the browser on the other end. That's all it does. It kind of goes up, goes to the shelf, goes to the place where it is, goes to the directory it is, opens it up, empties the contents, sends it right out. So that's the basic model for static files. If your file name is, usually the browser is set up so that if your file name is HTML or even TXT, it'll take that file and it'll just spit it down the line. It throws a couple of headers on the top of it saying this is HTML, but otherwise it just kind of takes everything in that file, sucks it out, sends it down the line. If that file has an extension, usually this is determined by extension, like .php or .py or .pl or .cgi or a whole range of extensions, the server can determine that it probably is something to be executed. Now there's other ways it can determine that too. Sometimes on the first line of the file it says this is something that should be executed rather than just spilled down. So what it does then is it reads in the program, and instead of spitting it down the line, it still goes to that location, opens up the file, opens it up, takes a look at what's inside, and instead of just sucking that stuff out and sending it down the line, it processes the material in the file first, and that material, either parts of it or the whole thing, will generate, will create, will write the HTML that gets sent down the line. We're going to be dealing with one language used for programming the web called PHP. And this was initially meant just to do little pieces of the total HTML. That is, you have a whole bunch of HTML, and then you have one line of HTML, and when we get to PHP we'll actually do this, that says print out today's date. So that's going to change. Each time the server goes to it, it's going to be a different file. It's not going to just spit out the contents. It's going to suck out those contents until it hits that little nugget of PHP, and that little nugget of PHP says, I need some pre-processing here. Find out what the date is and insert it on this line. So this is a little bit different, right? The server has to do a little bit more work. It has to process whatever it is in that file and follow the instructions in order to produce the stuff that gets sent down the line. Now what gets sent down the line is still just HTML. In other words, even if there's PHP in there, that PHP is something that addresses the server here. Once it leaves the server and gets sent to your browser, all that's being sent is HTML. So there's no way by viewing source, for example, on your browser to see whether it was produced by a web program or whether it was just statically produced by a regular person creating it. I mean, you can guess sometimes, if it's today's weather, that it's unlikely that they have gnomes coming in the middle of the night typing out full HTML pages for each weather report for each zip code. Highly unlikely. Much more likely is there's a program there that's pulling that data and combining it on the fly. All right. So where does it combine that stuff? Well, in some cases, like the date and time, that's something where it can pretty much do it just on the server itself. It kind of says, "Hey, self, what time is it?" and then inserts that stuff into the file. Sometimes it's getting data from a bunch of different files and combining them into one. So, for example, there was a time when we did something called server-side includes. It's much less common for that to happen now, at least as server-side includes. But you could do something like have a footer that you knew that you wanted to go on every HTML page, and then just have a little line of code at the bottom of the page in the programmable text that came through and said, hey, insert the footer here. Go to that file and insert the footer. So one place you look for data is in another file in the file system. you say, okay, we actually want to combine some things here. It's not just this file to the server. Go ahead and get this other one and combine it before you send it out. So that's one way you can get data. Another is to go to a database, and this is much more common. There are good reasons to go to a database. In many cases, especially when sites get very large, it's faster to pull data and put data into a database. So that's another place you can get data. You might go to a database and say, look up the prediction for the temperature for today for zip code 10001 or something like that, and then it'll just spit that, pull that out of the database, put it in the right place in this file before it spits the HTML back down towards the browser. Another place you might get data is actually from the user themselves. So maybe they've submitted a form and that data comes into the program, and then it says, okay, look and see if when you called this, if you included any data that we can use. So for example, when I type 10001 as the zip code, that's one of the data pieces that's going to go into this program. It's going to say, oh, 1001, okay, use that to go get the database data, stick it in here, now send the HTML back down the line. Finally, you might go out to the web itself and get more data that you then bring into your server and ship down on the HTML. This is what Google Reader does, for example. Maybe it doesn't do it instantaneously, some do. Some sites do, but in the broadest sense, maybe Google Reader does something like that, right? It goes and it goes through your list of files, and it goes out to the various blogs and other sources of RSS feeds, pulls those feeds in, and then spits it down the line to you via HTML. Few things to note here. One of them is usually these programs are only executed, that is, are only run when you call them. So you type in the URL, it goes there, it opens up that file, and it runs it. There are some that are cached. That is, since I'm probably not the only person that's going to be checking this weather report, it's stupid for it to do all this analysis over and over again. So maybe it just does it once a day. So the first time that anyone hits it in a day, it'll go and do the analysis. But now the next person and the next person just get a carbon copy. It kind of takes the program and spits out a very static version of it. So that's one other way. Finally, there are some things that run on, and we aren't going to worry too much about this until later, something called cron, C-R-O-N, which is a way of doing things at a particular time on a computer. So you may have this set up on, say, a Windows or Mac machine where you run well, if you're running Time Machine, it's a little funky, but where you run something at, say, 3 a.m., like a lot of you on Windows machines especially know you need to defrag once a week. You defrag your hard drive. So you may have set that up and scheduled it on your computer to, if it's on at 3 a.m. on a Saturday or a Sunday morning, that's a good time for it to defrag. So a similar thing happens on a lot of servers. It says once every 24 hours or once every 24 minutes or once every 24 seconds run these programs. And so sometimes that's the way it works. But generally the way it works is the program is executed, it's run, it goes through this process when you call it up in the server. All right. So as we go to these content management systems, there are a couple of ways programs are run, but that's the main way. When you call them up, you call up a program on the server, and rather than delivering a static page, it kind of does some of that processing on the computer, on the server, before it sends it back to you. So in order to use these effectively, we need to know a little bit about how to make sure that that files are executable. That is, that that the server knows that they're allowed to be executed by users. We need to know a little bit about how to set up the directory systems, although we've already dealt a little bit with that. And we need to know a little bit about how to set up databases so that these programs can write to the databases and can read from the databases when they're trying to produce HTML for us. So now we need to move on to that bit, which is how to set up databases so that they can be used by these programs that we're going to put on our server. All right, that's next.